evening all. My name is Christina Jardis, Chair of the Region 5 Stakeholder Advisory Committee. I would like to call the meeting to order at 5:31 p.m. on April 23rd, 2025. And any members of the public, I'm just going to remind you to sign in. I think over on the counter there is the sign up. So if you could do that, that'd be great. And we will hold public comment until the end. So while the meeting is in progress, we would appreciate it if you just would make a mark for yourselves and open up during that time at the end. Okay. And then before we continue, we will need a motion to approve the agenda for today's meeting. Yep, I was gonna say that was a double, and then spin with a second. They're so enthusiastic. Okay, vote. All in favor? Any opposed? Any opposed? With that, the meeting or the agenda has been adopted. We will also need a motion to approve the meeting minutes from our previous meeting on March 19th, 2025. Alice with the motion. Okay, Jim with a second. Okay, we'll move it to a vote. All in favor? Any opposed? With that, the meeting minutes have been approved. Turn it over to the OPZ team. Teach us all about land use.
Yep. Welcome, guys. This is the region plan process update. Again, just a reminder where we started about a year ago. Our first questionnaire seeking feedback from the community was released. Since then, that information has informed some of the discussions we've had at our previous topical meetings. Tonight, we'll provide an overview of land use and zoning, and then our May meetings, you as the SAC will make recommendations on how the zoning may need to change. This is just a look back on, or next one. Yep, and this is just a look at our previous meetings and the future meetings coming up. And, I'll hand it off to Mark to provide an overview of the designation and terms we'll be using over the next couple of months.
Okay, so real quick, everybody read the briefing paper, you know your difference between critical corridor, critical economic, commercial, low density residential, low to medium density residential. I'll just do a quick overview here tonight. Just to check the box here, we'll do this presentation, okay? So hopefully what you had picked up then in that briefing paper is we have three main categories to designate or to help guide growth or guide preservation of areas within the county. Our first are the development policy areas, DPAs, sometimes planners, we talk in acronyms. So, you know, forgive me if I say DPA, PRU, throughout the night or through the next couple months here when we talk about zoning. So we have development policy areas. Again, these are just those broad categories to identify some of the current uses within the county, as well as how we anticipate it growing and how it helps define some of the policies, or how we apply some of the policies for land use and how we grow in the future. So these are your, and we'll get into them shortly, but again, just looking throughout the county, we've got our neighborhood preservation areas, we have critical economic areas where, you know, you might see your industrial parks. And this is, I'll get to how does it change here after we go through all three. Planned land use is drilling in just a little bit deeper, and this then characterizes very generally, again, the uses on the ground. So along the Maryland 3 corridor, very generally, that would be considered commercial, right? And then in the Crofton area, the subdivisions, that would be considered one of your types of residential planned land use categories, depending upon the zoning within that area, because What I then want to emphasize when we get to zoning is zoning and planned land use need to be consistent with each other. Or otherwise it just doesn't make sense, where if you have an area zoned residential, but the planned land use, which should help guide how those uses are in the future, is commercial, you've got this mismatch, right? So as we go through these exercises over the next couple months, or over the next month or so, that's gonna be a major theme, is making sure that whatever recommendations you have for zoning, we're gonna wanna match a consistent planned land use with it. And again, zoning is then the actual regulation of what you can and do on your property. It lists out the permitted uses, whether you can do a single family home or a townhome, for example, whether you can do sort of the size of commercial or retail on your property, whether you can do a contractor's yard or whether you can't do a contractor's yard. Zoning also then includes the bulk regulations. How many units per acre can you build on a property that's zoned residential, or how big can your commercial building be? How tall can it be? Items, and how far back from the road do some of these buildings need to be? So it sort of, you know, puts these ideas then on a plan where you can sort of diagram where that building can be, and sort of the intensity then of that use on the property. So how do these change? Looking at the first two development policy areas and planned land use, these will be within the region plan. So sort of as we get further along here, we're gonna have two deliverables, essentially. We're gonna have a region plan that provides an introduction to Region 5. It's gonna have an existing conditions section. We're gonna go through a lot of the topics. It's gonna have an explanation of the topics that we previously discussed. It's gonna have that implementation matrix in it of the strategies, right, that try to address some of the issues that we had heard, or again, continue a lot of the good things that we've heard as well. It will also then have the development policy area map and the planned land use map, because they aren't regulatory in that sense. The other deliverable then is going to be the draft zoning map, which then is regulatory. So, you know, fast forward to this time next year when county council is reviewing these two deliverables, it's gonna be two bills, two pieces of legislation that would ultimately get adopted. Okay, so again, grouping development policy areas and planned land use together, and then align between those with zoning. Okay. So getting into development policy areas, the tannish color or peachish color here is neighborhood preservation. And you'll see that it's a lot of the existing subdivisions within Region 5, the already built out single family homes or townhomes. And this is, again, the policy that we apply here is that we don't expect a lot of change happening within these areas. We don't expect a lot of necessarily upzoning, downzoning, or intense development. There might be an empty lot that somebody may not have built out at a certain point, and we would see that as infill type of development. Okay. Green is your then rural and agricultural areas. This is your very low density residential or agricultural type of uses. You may even see some type of limited commercial industrial within these areas, but again, these are areas where the county does not expect to see any type of growth happen in the rural and agricultural. And then another designation on this map is the critical corridor. That's our Route 3 corridor. This is an area, and again, these designations were born out of Plan 2040. And during that time, we had heard, well, yes, there's a lot of development along Maryland 3, but we really need to study how we anticipate or plan for growth within this corridor, making sure that it doesn't burden that corridor even further. Okay, so that's where we're looking for opportunities to improve safety and mobility. And again, just making sure that there is that preservation of adjacent neighborhoods. Critical economic, while not necessarily in Region 5, borders it here up towards the Odenton area. This is the Fort Meade area, as well as National Business Park. And again, these are economic engines within the county where you're gonna see major office parks or industrial areas, warehousing, those types of things. And then within the last designation with development policy area that's within Region 5 is the town center. There are 3 town centers within the county: Odenton Town Center, which is wholly within Region 5, the Pearl Town Center, and the Glen Burnie Town Center. And typically those town centers do have master plans themselves that guide development and growth for those areas. Glen Burnie doesn't, but doesn't have a master plan yet, but they do have some additional guidance and tools that can help focus and incentivize development to those areas. So we have development policy areas. We also then have overlays because we wanted to sort of take that one step further and say, well, within the town center, for example, or within some of these neighborhood preservation areas or critical economic areas, there are a couple other special designations we'd like to apply. So for example, there's the transit-oriented development policy area overlay. And if you know, they've got a MARC station, and the idea here is if you can support growth around that train station, you might be able to support additional types of lifestyles where people may not necessarily need cars to get where they need to go. They could use public transportation, whether it be rail or buses that access the town center. And again, that really being the policy here where we want to facilitate pedestrian-oriented mix of uses again, so that you don't have residential in one area, commercial in another, and people probably have to drive there. This is your commercial or office on the first floor and your residential above. That's the vision for the Odenton Town Center. Okay, before I move on to planned land use, any questions on development policy area? Sort of get the idea, it's very broad, sort of sets out what generally a vision may be for an area like neighborhood preservation. Like I said, not really a lot of growth is anticipated in those types of areas. Good. Okay, so then planned land use is getting, like I said, drill a little bit deeper, and it actually then reflects the uses on the sites. So we've got quite a mishmash of planned land use designations within Region 5, which is the purple area here. But you can see there's a good mix of green. Some of your beige colors or the lighter beige colors are your residential planned land use designations. And again, up here at the Odenton Town Center is the town center planned land use designation. The Wall Chapel area is your mixed use, given the commercial. It may not necessarily be commercial or office on the first floor and residential above, which we would consider, say, vertically mixed use types of development. This is more of that horizontal mixed use type of development, but all part of one property or project. So we would consider that mixed use. And then we do have a smattering of some industrial around the area. And then your darker greens are your conservation and like parks and open space as well. Okay. Good. Steve?
Question, assuming Two Rivers is in that beige area.
Yeah.
How do we reconcile low density residential when none of it is low density residential?
Well, so that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up because perspective is a big key to our discussion, right? Is what you may see as low density residential, somebody may see as something else. And so that's why we need to get on the same page of discussion so that we can talk about sort of what the county actually defines as low density residential. So in this case, Two Rivers is zoned that would R2. Typically 2 units per acre. You may not necessarily get 2 units per acre, but that would be the max. I think 2.5 if you do have sewer. But so we again categorize. I know it might be a little small on this graphic here. We will provide a poster size of this graphic when we meet in May. so that it's an easy reference that you can go to. We can put it on the table as well, so that we're all on the same page that, for example, the zoning districts, rural and agricultural and residential low density are what we consider rural planned land uses or falls within that designation. R1, which is typically your 1 unit per acre, R2, 2 units per acre, let's say, for low density residential. R5, that gets you 5 units per acre, is low to medium density residential. R10, medium density residential, R15 and R22 as high density residential. Right?
I assume you take into account open space.
So that can be taken into account looking at the overall density of the project.
Cause I mean, there aren't any lots that are more than 8,000 square feet. So that's closer to five per acre,
And I believe there is quite a bit of open space that is provided.
and they
for
take that into
recreation
account
area
and
or-
divvy it up.
Yeah, area that
It's a little
isn't
more-
developed.
It's a little bit more macro than micro. if you think
Right,
about it that way.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Two Rivers is another situation as well that we'll talk about here in a few minutes.
Did you describe RA? Because that's 1 for 5 acre, right? 1 for
1 or 2 acre.
RA is your 1 to 20. Yeah.
1 to 20.
Did I see mention of the R44 in the briefing paper?
So we don't have a residential zoning district of R44. 44 units would come into play for one of our new mixed use zoning districts. That would be the MXDU or urban, that we really, trying to think of where it's been applied so far. Jim, do you have any to think about that? I can tell you it's not in Region 5. If it were to be in, thinking of, and because there was a new piece of legislation that got adopted within the year that changed our former mixed use zoning districts to new zoning districts and actually added one. And we did have a crosswalk between that. So if it was, for example, mixed use T for transit, that now became mixed use urban. But it actually got a higher density would apply in that situation. So I'm trying to think where there was an MXDT within the county beforehand.
Where's the T?
T.
Yeah, out by the airport, Ridge Road area.
So, right, as part of Region 1, for example, they're currently going through the legislative phase at council right now. And some of those areas are zoned MXDU. That's Cromwell. Cromwell is proposed to be MXDU, for example, where the light rail station is, and across the street at the shopping plaza in that general vicinity. So if we're good on plan land use, I know it sort of leads into our discussion with zoning. And like I said, I think, this conversation was good. We're describing these RA, RLD, that fits into our rural plan land use designation, R1 or 2. And again, if you get picking up on this, the number suffix really relates to the number of dwelling units per acre as a measure for that designation. We also then have our commercial zoning districts. Small businesses really categorized as an other type of zoning district, but we can lump that into our commercial land use designation. And again, we have our various commercial zoning districts. Industrial maritime doesn't really apply to our discussion here. Mixed use and some of these others then as they fall down the chart. So again, just really want to talk briefly then about our zoning districts. If everybody's good with plan land use. Okay. So again, residential zoning districts, we've got everything from RA, which is our least intense, all the way up to R22, which you would see as typically your apartments or condo type of units. Okay, and I do want to emphasize here too, that while you may end up getting, or sorry, what may end up being permitted is 5 units per acre, but the yield that you actually see after roads, recreation areas, any other requirements, is typically less than that max number that you would see then at the end of that R designation.
And there's also situations like RA where there's, instead of one house for 20 acres, it was pre-platted, you know, and,
Yeah.
so nothing.
There can be some nuance.
Yeah, there's always nuances in these, zoning categories, or districts.
And again, the other point too here is they're not always strictly residential. Some may have permitting religious facilities. I think some even may include home occupations. So again, while you look at them strictly residential, you know, there can be some leeway if maybe you see a daycare within your residential area or subdivision. Okay, so then moving on to our commercial zoning districts based on intensity from C1 to C4. And as you can imagine, that the suffix number there, while it also relates to intensity, also relates to where you may find it. So for example, C1 is our local commercial zoning district that you might see as a corner store designated as, or C4, which is your highway commercial, where you would see your auto dealerships. Auto dealerships would be permitted in C4, where they may not necessarily, where they may not be permitted in C1, for example. Okay. And again, this is down at 424, 450 Staples corner. We have a variety of C1 zoning, small business, C4, which I believe is a contractor's yard. If somebody wants to correct or can verify that, just east of 424. Okay. Our industrial zoning districts, again, range from W1 to W3, least intense to most intense. Least intense is what we really anticipate being office parks or warehousing. W2 would introduce more nuisance. What the county may consider nuisance uses such as contractors' yards. And W3 would be your power plants, for example, up on Brandon Shores area, that would be zone W3. Moving on to our mixed use zoning districts. So the zoning districts, like I said, because there was the bill that was recently introduced, we do have these former, I think it's really just the Watchapel area that's mixed use. That got crosswalked to the new zoning district, okay, for example. But again, so now as we go into our discussions, making recommendations of zoning, we're gonna be applying these new zoning districts. Everything from your least intense MXD V for village up to MXD U for urban. So this is your opportunity then to look at the area, region, and identify whether, if you want to apply or make a recommendation for any additional mixed use areas based on these new recommendations, or sorry, the new legislation for these zoning districts. And again, you typically have the mix of uses, whether it's residential and commercial. We do lump office into a commercial use, whether it's horizontally mixed use or vertically mixed use. Okay. Okay, so before we actually dive into looking at some examples, any questions so far on zoning, plan, land use, development policy area, just those designations?
You can see all these on the website when you go through the map, right? That's where you grabbed all of these snips from.
Yeah, which website are you referring to? The one that's on the Region 5 hub site?
It's like the map of all maps that all, Anne Arundel County stuff
Okay. Mhm.
pulls from. Is that correct? It's like the zoning, you can look at everything. There's like different filters for it.
Yeah.
But the reason why I'm asking that question, it's kind of a leading question, because I know I myself have like clicked around on things to help me understand things better. So if anybody, needs that tool, I think, yeah, you get to it through the Region 5 website, but there's also a way to look at the various maps through the like Anne Arundel County page, I can't remember where, that gets you to the other. Cause you can look at, like, I've used it before for looking at stormwater systems and stuff like that, but.
In a follow-up email to this meeting, I'll provide a link to that website of all of our maps, but highlight the one that you're speaking of as well. So you can just scroll around and take a look.
For any visual folks here, I know I am.
Okay. So again, just want to look at a couple of examples, just to be able to apply some of these terms and designations to areas within Region 5. So one example that we pulled here was the Crofton area. You can imagine that's going to be designated as neighborhood preservation, right? It's for the most part built out. Don't expect any significant development or redevelopment within that area. So you can see that this tan color here applies to most of these then subdivisions and the Crofton Triangle. So I think that area is then zoned R5, and that would be a plot, that would be planned land use that would be consistent with R5, would then be low to medium density residential. Right? And like I said, then the zoning is R5. Right, so you sort of see this, for the most part, consistency, you know, whether you're reading it forwards or backwards. Right, so if you see R5, you know it's going to be a low density residential planned land use, and you can probably guess that it's going to be neighborhood preservation. You can then also go opposite when I say if it's neighborhood preservation, chances are it's going to be a residential planned land use designation, and then again, choosing one of those residential zoning districts. All right. Another example here then is the Maryland 3 corridor. And again, the development policy area designation is critical corridor, recognizing that we need to take safety and accessibility into consideration because this is mostly a commercial corridor. And so you can then assume that there's some type of commercial zoning district within this area, right? So yeah, reading it front to back, you can make some educated guesses of what those designations or zoning districts are going to be. Good.
So Mark, when you look at the
Yeah.
EPA, if you go through, and maybe this is too much in the noise, but is there can you give us an example sometimes of something that we might be able to work as a group? Because if the policy is already defined, I guess I'm looking for how much work do we have to do that's not already done or already determined?
Yeah, great question. Is one thing we may look for is, for the most part, so the development policy area is from Plan 2040. That's what we're making our recommendations off of for development policy area and plan land use, right? So back while we were doing creating those maps, 3 or 4 years ago, we may have missed some properties that should be included within this. I think for the most part, for Maryland 3, we took anything that fronted on Maryland 3 or had that commercial type of use that had only access from Maryland 3. So as we look through this map, you may say, hey, look, we forgot this one property that, only has access on Maryland 3. Maryland 3 has some of these spurs that are dead end roads.
Yeah.
So we may want to take those into consideration and say, hey, given maybe some future development on some of these stubs. And, depending upon your recommendation of what the zoning may be for those stubs, you can say, this could have an impact on this critical corridor, on this corridor. Let's lump those properties into this development policy area. So that's what we'd be looking for your feedback. Y'all, I'm sure have been down some of these stubs or a lot of these back roads where you're like, nope, I know for sure it has this characteristic or it has this type of access. And that will help then have a conversation about, what the use may be at the end of that dead end road, or if we want to, again, carve it out to be a different type of development policy area, those types of changes. Oh, another hand up.
So it could go either way. Then
Yeah,
we could say, well, we don't think that should be commercial. I think that probably should be a different definition.
right. And again, we do need to work within some of the constraints of what is actually built on that property,
Yeah,
right?
so
Yes, right, exactly. Yeah, or maybe it's a vacant building and there's a potential, let's say it was a former bank, some banks are now becoming vacant. And you could say, maybe this is an area that's right for mixed use. That could be a recommendation too.
But a house that's not one of those stubs might not be. I think that's kind of a good example of like what might go either way, right? Cause I know there's a couple of those in Crofton specifically.
So
yeah,
it's,
if you change a use or a zone and it's in conflict with the current use or zone, is that possible?
so do you have an example in mind
Sure, yeah.
that you can share with folks so that we can talk it through?
Well, if a property is zoned commercial,
Okay,
then you would like it not to be zoned commercial.
And it's vacant. okay. That could be the recommendation of the stakeholder advisory committee. Right, and those are the good discussions that we want to have, right, is what to do with some of these vacant or underutilized properties.
And there's also applications that are being, fed to us too, right, from various property.
Yep, exactly, so, from October to December, property owners had the opportunity to submit an application requesting a rezoning for their property. So you as the stakeholder advisory committee will review these applications again next month when we review the maps. And you can make recommendations of whether you think their request, whether you agree with their request or don't, you can come up with something completely different as well. Okay,
Mark, will you, to the extent you guys can, for making recommendations, speak of what the existing uses are that are there, so you don't end up in like a non-conforming use situation?
sure, yeah. And so Jim brought up non-conforming uses. We've got a slide on that here coming up just to, again, help you with some of the terminology that we use during our discussion. Okay. I think one last example here is the Odenton Town Center. Again, this is kind of a different beast that we just need to treat a little bit differently. Again, because it is one of the town centers within the county, as a development policy area, like I mentioned before, typically around train stations or light rail stations, we may have a transit-oriented development policy area overlay, plan land use, obviously town center, and then within the Odenton Town Center, it has its own specific zoning district. So OTC-C is the Odenton Town Center 4. This is that area really around the train station that we really want to focus development. Then we also have the OTC transition area, which are some areas just adjacent to that core, sort of radiating out from the train station. We have an Odenton Town Center industrial area, which if you're familiar with that area just south of Maryland 32, are more of your warehouses. There's some contractor yards back in that area as well. And we'll get to sort of how we'll ask you to make recommendations for that area as well, given that there is already a master plan that provided guidance. And there is actually a committee, just like you all, for the Odenton Town Center. So we'll be working together with them, not necessarily in the same room, but we'll be facilitating that discussion as well. Okay, so that you know what they're recommending and vice versa. Okay, so I think, you know, Nita, your question too might be a good segue to how we're looking at this. It's a little complicated, but the point here is we're starting with this consistency review where we look at planned land use because that was most recently adopted through Plan 2040. Last zoning was about 10 years ago. A lot may have changed in those 10 years where the zoning now may not be consistent with the planned land use that was adopted again 3 years ago. We're doing that analysis internally, identifying where we need to, again, make the recommendation to change the zoning so it's consistent with the planned land use. There may also be situations where we retain the zoning and maybe we got the planned land use wrong in Plan 2040. So then we have to make a recommendation to change the planned land use so that that's consistent. Okay, so that's the left side. And on the right side is the comprehensive review. So again, Office Planning and Zoning will be making recommendations where we may see that there's a change in character and may recommend a change in the zoning. Stakeholder Advisory Committee, you all will be making your own recommendations, not just on the applications, but for the entire region. Okay. And then we also have our owner applications, which are sort of spurring certain discussions about certain properties based on what that property owner has requested. So in some of these cases, you may be recommending a change to the zoning. In some of these cases, you may be recommending a change to the zoning that also requires a change in the planned land use. Using Nita's example is where you may have a property that has a planned land use of commercial, but maybe you all want to make a change of a recommendation for that property to become low density residential. That would then obviously necessitate a recommended change in zoning. Okay, so my point here is we're going to be working both ways, right? Making recommendations to planned land use, making recommendations to zoning, just to make sure then that they're consistent. Okay.
But most of the owner applications are gonna be non-conforming, right? I mean, we may do a zoning change, but we leave the PDU and the DPA untouched because it's not.
They may not always be non-conforming uses.
But it's, I would imagine.
So if it's a vacant property, then we can make whatever recommendation.
I'm just saying that you can't just keep redrawing the lines based on the policy because
Sure.
you just have a mess, right? You never be able to unwind it in the future. And maybe I'm wrong, but it just seems like there's some big, like Odenton Town Center's predefined, but if somebody said, hey, I have this little lot, I wanna make it commercial and open up an ice cream store.
Mhm.
And we said, yeah, we're gonna let you go and make that commercial, that's gonna be a non-conforming, because we're not gonna redefine Odenton Town Center.
Well, non-conforming would deal more with if, say, for example, what's a good example? You have a use that's permitted in C1, let's say C4, for example, and you change the zoning to C1. That C4 use is now non-conforming. We consider it grandfathered in. It was a permitted use at the time that it was established, right? So they don't close the next day once C1 becomes effective. They can register to become non-conforming use. And with that, there's a variety of sort of conditions that they have to meet about certifying that, their use was legal when it was built, and it has to, if they were to burn down, certain conditions then of how to rebuild and continue that use.
But then if that use ever discontinues for a certain amount of time, it can only be replaced.
Exactly.
You're preparing for the future of what they can do.
Non-conforming is more grandfather.
We're not kicking people out.
Got it, right, I got it, okay.
So again, I know a lot of arrows, but the point being, we're gonna be having these discussions forwards and backwards. Whether you wanna look at it, as somebody had said, on a macro scale versus the micro scale. I think that's a good description. Okay, so some of the types of use, or sorry, some of the types of changes that have been part of the Office of Planning and Zoning's analysis, or when we started this back in April, actually, days ago, so last year, have been looking at those planned land use from Plan 2040. And again, this is an example, this was just a really good example, illustrating the different colors. I believe it's in Region 7. But from Plan 2040, you had high density residential and some medium density residential here on the tip there. And you see that it really does follow the parcel. And it really does reflect what's actually built on the ground. However, the zoning at the time, you had some, let's just say R10, R15. They didn't quite match the parcel boundaries. You see, for example, the zoning is actually splitting one of the condos. So during the Region 7 comprehensive zoning process, the idea was to then ensure that the zoning matches not only the parcel lines, but snaps them more closely to the planned land use designation. Right? And you see how it's changed here, where, again, if that's high density residential, if this orange is R15, a medium density residential, then this might be, say, R10, for example.
That's what I was trying to say.
Okay.
Because you're gonna have all these little designations and areas changing, which provides a lot of complexity. I'm not saying it's good or bad, I could just see that happening, which is what you just demonstrated.
Okay. Okay, the other thing too that's happened, for example, over the past 10 years, is we've been working in a digital zoning file. As you can imagine, things may shift. We get new plats in that have been surveyed. They may not always match with the parcel boundaries or the zoning boundaries. So what we've been doing then is identifying where there might be, where we see that the geometry, right? So the green here outlined, and then you do have this sliver of red for C2, but they don't follow the parcel boundaries. Somehow they shifted, again, over time. And so all we're doing then is making that recommendation to, again, snap the zoning district line to the parcel boundary. We're just aligning those zoning and parcel boundaries. It's a very small thing, but it's a very important thing to make sure that we don't split zone anybody's parcel without any specific intention or rationale. There may be reasons where we do want to split zone a property, but typically you don't want to do that because there are more tools and better tools in the toolbox, like within the code itself, to regulate things like that. Okay, so pretty straightforward there.
And the reason why that happened was because of like the evolution of technology, right?
Exactly,
The fact that
yeah.
we can actually put a legitimate pin in the ground and
Right.
identify things.
Okay, so then the other type of change we're recommending is open space. So on the left-hand side is the existing zoning, and you can see that we have this stretch of green, which is open space zoning. And it sort of just meanders south. This is along Aviation Boulevard near the airport in Region 1. But again, the example being that floodplain, or sorry, that open space zoning was based on a floodplain designation from 40 years ago, let's say. And things have obviously changed over time. And again, we have better tools in the toolbox that help protect against impacts or adverse impacts, natural resources. So what the recommendation is in these region plans and comprehensive zoning process is to, again, snap the open space zoning to just those properties that are designated as public parks or privately owned areas that provide those active and passive recreational amenities, or when you're going through the subdivision process, and there's a floodplain, you have to plat that floodplain and that becomes protected. Any other type of easements or anywhere where there may be environmentally sensitive resources. And in this case, there's sort of been a little deviation from when we started with region 2, or sorry, the first round of region plans. Now with rounds 2 and 3, where if a property will retain the open space and maintain that split, for example, you can see, for example, these properties here have a split of some type of industrial zoning and open space. We'll maintain that that split open space zoning if it's greater than 20% of the property and has environmental resources on that property. Okay. So just want to make that clear is as we go through this analysis, it'll be snapped to wholly public parks, active passive recreational amenities, floodplains, easements, as well as properties where you're still seeing the open space and it's greater than 20% of that property, and has environmental resources on, natural resources on. And we use a variety of layers at the county to identify those natural resources. I think we actually pull them from a specific section of the code that references those layers. Yeah.
Where's the 20% rule? Where's that in the matrix? That in 2040?
No, that, like I said, that was the deviation. So Plan 2040 provided us this guidance. But as we were working through the various rounds of region plans, we had heard from stakeholders that elements of Article 17, which is the subdivision section of the code, may not necessarily, in their perspective, may not provide the level of protection that's adequate. So this is the Office of Planning and Zoning reacting to those concerns and making this call at 20%. So I know I'm just providing little, screenshots of areas, just very small areas within the county that provide a good example. But again, when we roll out the maps and you see this on a bigger screen in the bigger context, it might make a little more sense. And when we pop on additional layers, so when we meet in May, we'll have our master online zoning tool and mapping tool where we can put on streams, floodplains, and look at how maybe some of those layers have influenced zoning over time.
Is that GIS or you use something else?
Yeah, right, it's GIS, but for the public facing tool and our own sort of internal tool, it's been modified into a program.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's the land use and zoning viewer that I was thinking of, where you can just check things on and off.
All right, so planned unit developments, we actually have a bunch in Region 5, right? The Two Rivers area, Pine Orchard, for example. And so because there have been unique agreements executed when these projects were approved and built, we are actually recommending to keep the zoning as is, because that was the zoning that the project, the applicant was working off of at the time. So if we started to make recommendations to change the zoning, even if it was to better, again, snap the zoning line to the parcel boundary, and somebody were to go back and say, well, how did they get this density? You wouldn't be able to compute that. You would still have to go back to the plat to better understand those calculations. And so that's what we really want to memorialize here when we go through the zoning analysis is leave it as is, as it was built.
So even the controversial landfill down there, we don't want to, we can't touch that?
So the landfill's not part of the planned unit development, as I understand it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know it's something that everybody talks about.
Parcel
Right.
Terrace, New Chesapeake Terrace.
Well, the landfill, the new landfill they want to build right on.
Right.
Chesapeake Terrace from a landfill.
Yeah, it's called.
Oh, yeah, you talked
Yeah.
about that before. Yeah, yeah.
And they are within the zoning is unfortunately correct. Yeah.
You're saying the zoning for Two Rivers, none of the zoning for Two Rivers has changed?
We're not recommending a change to the zoning, the office planning and zoning. Because again, we wanna be able to, you know, for anybody that might be scrolling and just curious what the zoning is around the county, can see, hey, the zoning looks a little wonky. This obviously was part of a planned unit development. And again, to ensure that folks recognize that if you were to make the change to a new zoning district and you were to see what was actually built, it wouldn't make sense. So we want to maintain sort of this wonky zoning so that it again reflects the agreement, the unique agreement that was executed at the time of approval.
So if I'm looking at a Two Rivers development map from 2020 that showed a park and environmental protected area that is now 220 more homes. There wasn't a change in zoning to do that?
For parcel O is what are you thinking about parcel O?
Oh, it's in future, isn't it, or is that the current?
No, you're correct, Mark. He's talking about parcel O.
Yeah, right. So that would be part of the planned unit development.
So even though they told us one thing, it was intended to be developed anyway.
So, you know, I can't go into necessarily the details for each project of what may have been promised or approved for certain lots at certain times. We're looking at just the outline of these types of projects called planned unit developments where, again, the zoning may be a little wonky, but it allows the developer to sort of move, I don't know if that's even the technical word is, but sort of massage some of the zoning within the area to build the project. So if I do touch on parcel O, it would, I guess I would have to say, it's part of that planned unit development. There's a certain density that was approved for this area, or a certain number of units that may have been vested for that area. And, you know, any future decisions that may exceed or change, again, that unique agreement would need to, probably come in for new approval. Or some type of special exception.
And that's then where our recommendations would be taken into account, right?
You could, right, is looking at plan. You all have the opportunity to make recommendations on all of Region 5. The Office of Planning and Zoning's analysis and our policy has been for planned unit developments. Anything within that boundary, we're leaving the zoning as is.
So do those maps show the boundaries of the planned unit development?
The maps the online maps, I think there is a layer within one of the maps, but again, we'll have that available on the days that we need to review zoning. To sort of show you what properties are or aren't, like, you know, the terrace land. So,
So you're saying all planned unit developments, we shouldn't even bother looking at? And Two Rivers is one of them.
that's the Office Planning and Zoning's fault.
It doesn't have to be our approach.
What's that?
It doesn't have to be our approach. I guess we can make
Yeah.
recommendations.
And here's what he's recommending, because if we present that to the council, they're gonna detail what we present anyway, so.
Mark, aren't PUDs established through special exceptions usually, or that?
I'm not sure, we have Lynn Miller on the line if she wants to
I
confirm.
guess the only other thing, you'll probably get to it, but how the zoning is one designation, but you could have a variety of uses within that zone.
Mhm.
So you don't necessarily need to rezone a property to change the use within it, which is like
And
another
that's-
layer to the complexity of
Yeah.
it.
And that was it, that's why I had my hand up, that's what I was gonna
Okay.
add to it. So to piggyback on what Mark said, and by far, that was the best answer I heard planning and zoning give about parcel O and Two Rivers. You did a
It's
really
not
good
it's
job
not
of
a
that.
formal
That was really good.
position,
But the
it's just saying
zoning-
typically.
Jim was correct. The zoning is what you originally asked about. So the zoning and for the development is the entire development, whether it has a golf course or a pool or the housing. So the zoning for parcel O is the same as the rest of Two Rivers. It's just that originally it was designated to be something else. It was originally designated to be a golf course, and then it was supposed to be left alone and just green space or a park or whatever. So it falls under the zoning.
So they keep
And
changing their
it
mind on what they're
creates
putting
what
there.
Mark said, that they, at this point, would have to ask for a special exception to their original project to develop that parcel.
Because it has more units than they had originally
Yes,
allowed, yeah.
yes.
So I'm gonna call on Cindy Carrier behind you, who's our planning and zoning, the long range planning administrator.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, Two Rivers is a little bit different than most of our planning and developments in the county, in that in 2004, after the small area plan for Odenton was adopted, the comprehensive zoning that followed rezoned Two Rivers from RA to R2. So to my knowledge, like the boundary of that community is R2. So that's not gonna happen. There's been a little bit of shifting in parcel lines, there's been slivers, what we would call slivers. But other than that, it's pretty much one living category, unlike Piney Orchard and some of the others, in the top.
So I wanted to advance to this slide here, to again emphasize that this is the chart you'll find within the plan. So that, you know, what we'll do is, within the region plan, like I said, is where we'll have our planned land use map. And we'll also have a table where we identify where the changes are happening, just so that, again, somebody picking up this document in 10 years can say, well, why did this change? What were some of the reasons for it? This table will be included in that plan, and you'll see we have a column for the SAC recommended plan land use. You'll provide a justification as to why you're making that recommendation. There will be a planning advisory board recommendation. They come into play in the fall after you all have finished your work. And then the final recommended plan land use is the Office of Planning and Zoning's position. So when all this gets presented to county council, they'll be able to see your recommendation and justification, the planning advisory board's recommendation and justification, and Office of Planning and Zoning. There may be a situation where two of those positions are different from each other, or all three are different, or all three are the same. Okay. So again, just to sort of emphasize that what the discussions that you all have and recommendations you have will be recorded and presented in the plan. And will be presented to the planning advisory board as well as county council. And they'll take your recommendations into consideration. Okay. Good on PUDs? Okay. Lastly then, like I said, is there may be changes that the Office of Planning and Zoning may recommend, or you all as a stakeholder advisory committee recommend that may not, fall in line with these other previous ones that I had mentioned. Okay, it could just be a change in character in the community. Could be, a hot intersection that now has gotten a lot of attention, now that Maryland 3 has grown up over the past 10 years, for example. There are property owner applications that, again, we'll discuss. And then, as I mentioned before, is the Odenton Town Center Advisory Committee. They've got a set of recommendations and a draft zoning map that they would like you all to take into consideration when making recommendations as well. Okay, so a couple things to consider, or before I get into holding capacity, any questions on the types of changes that planning and zoning has looked at, or anything else that has come up as far as questions about types of changes? No? Okay, so sort of now moving into the items of what to look for when we do our analysis and make the recommendations, we as the stakeholder advisory committee. One is the holding capacity analysis. I know there's a lot of words up here. Very simply, we've looked at the forecast for households. We've also done an analysis then looking at the existing zoning and looking at vacant parcels or underutilized parcels that have the potential for residential. And maxing out at build out what those residential zoning districts and a couple other districts that allow residential. Based on build out of those vacant or underutilized parcels, what would be then the difference in that household forecast for the next 20 years? So for example, I'm just gonna skip ahead here. For Region 5, household forecast is about 4,800 units, or 4,800 households. And based on our analysis of zoning, we would project about 4,200, 4,300 units, okay? And so we see that as a shortfall of about 580 households. So the question is, the point is that based on existing zoning, we're not able to accommodate the growth that's projected for this area over the next 20 years. Okay, we've got the other adjacent regions here up on this chart as well as the county. And again, just want to emphasize that they're not growth targets. When we presented this to other regions during the other rounds, it wasn't a matter of where we're keeping a score sheet and saying, okay, you've upzoned this area, we're gonna get another, 500 units. Okay, we just need 80 more to go, and then we're even. We're not going about it this way. It's really just to illustrate to you all that there is this deficit based on a variety of issues. For example, we have Fort Meade adjacent to Region 5. And we anticipate Fort Meade to keep growing to support the various activities and missions that they have on base. And so how do we accommodate that growth? And if it's not happening here, then that growth could be happening and growth by, what I mean is, say, residential units. Could be happening in Howard or Carroll County. And those people are then gonna drive to get to Fort Meade. They're gonna have to use the roads. So one thing to balance here is residential growth, potentially less traffic, because that could support more public transportation within the region, or no growth, housing prices could stay high, and people are having to commute in. I'm just providing a few examples of some of the implications or trade-offs that you're gonna have to consider here when we talk about any zoning recommendations. Chuck?
So, the holding capacity, that mainly discusses it in terms of people, but it may not include, it doesn't include schools or other factors that affect population, and it's a population or a household analysis versus other variables are not in that?
Yeah, I haven't dug into the actual analysis. It's actually not done in-house. It's done by the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. But again, it is just that forecast of, the growth that we expect within Region 5. So again, ideally, you would want to try to chip away at this. But again, you don't necessarily have to look at Region 5 as the whole. We've talked about Odenton Town Center as potentially that opportunity of where to focus growth. And now this leads us back to the discussion of development policy areas, right? Do you see these neighborhood preservation areas? Do we need to tweak any of the boundaries, or are they very well set? Or any areas where we do want to anticipate growth and apply the appropriate development policy area there? Okay. Any questions on holding capacity? I know this may sort of set off some alarm bells, because this is where we get into the discussion of just put up a no vacancy sign, the community doesn't want any growth, or close, or no growth. But, again, is I want to encourage you to sort of think about some of the implications of no growth and what that means. Okay. Or where we want to direct growth, right? Okay. Well, we can revisit this when we meet in May. If you want, we can do another sort of quick overview of the designations again, just as a quick refresher. Can bring this up just to sort of, again, have this in your mind that, again, we anticipated in 15 years, that there may be a deficit of housing based on existing zoning.
What region is 6 and 8?
Yes, sorry about
What
that.
area is the, region 6 and 8?
Yeah, thanks. So Region 6 is the Crownsville area to the east. Yep, Region 8 is south of 450.
Okay.
Region 3 is the Severn area to the north, and Region 2 is Fort Meade and the Patuxent Research Refuge to the west.
Okay, so if I'm reading this correct, 6 and 8 have more housing or less? I'm trying to read.
So because those are mostly agricultural, like low density residential areas with RA or RLD zoning, and there isn't a lot of anticipated growth within those areas.
Okay, okay.
And again, based on the existing zoning that they have, maybe some vacant lots that haven't been developed, they are in the positive here because they're able to potentially build those lots or develop those into homes, which could then meet that household forecast.
Is Region 2 so deficient then, because a lot of that property is publicly owned and not zoned for development? Is that why it's so deficient?
So it doesn't take into account so Region 2 zoning has recently been completed.
Oh, okay.
This analysis doesn't take into account some of the recommendations, or it doesn't take into account the new zoning districts.
Right.
Or changes to zoning. Jim served on that committee, and I would say that there was a strong effort to sort of bump up some of the densities, or at least encourage mixed use on some properties that might be ripe for redevelopment. For example, the Laurel Racetrack.
Right.
Right. So I would imagine next time this analysis is run, that number would drop. But it also, again, household forecast could take into account Fort Meade's growth, which is in Region 2, and National Business Park, Arundel Mills. So there are a lot of employment centers within Region 2 that could be driving the top number here so much. And then I think what you were saying is the zoning may not be there to capture those.
If you have conservation areas or
Yeah.
federally held properties, they can't be zoned for
Right.
development, so
Yeah.
you can't.
Yeah.
You can't get there to meet it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so again, another thing that comes up during our discussions is, Charlie, you hit on it, is what happens if you all want to make a recommendation to change the zoning district for a property where now this new zoning district doesn't allow what is currently on the property. So again, there is an avenue, a path for those property owners to take. Obviously, again, they can register those non-conforming uses, they may not, but again, it's not like the county goes through these areas the next day and says, your permitted use is not allowed in the zoning district, you gotta shut down. There are avenues for these businesses to continue, for these uses to continue.
From a scope perspective, how many did you get by December, like 5 or 400?
Applications?
Yeah,
I think somewhere around 35.
that's not
Yeah.
horrible.
So we have, I would say that there are some strong groupings, Maryland 3, obviously.
Yeah.
But you'll see that sometimes word of mouth helps, right? Sometimes if you're a property owner and you want your property, the zoning change, you might say to your neighbor, hey, put in and make the same make the same request I did, or something like that, so.
Or similar, yeah.
Yeah. And again, some of it is just based on change of character, how things have developed or transitioned over the past 10 years. Or even families that have, or, individuals that have gotten older and said, you know what? I want to upzone my property and have this be an investment, or I want to subdivide some of my property so that my kids can live on it. So, okay. So is everybody clear on non-conforming uses? So then there's the taking issue. So for example, if it's a commercial property and now all of a sudden you're zoning it to open space, where now that property owner has lost all economically viable use of that property, that could be considered a taking and open up the county to a lawsuit. So again, you don't typically want to make those drastic types of recommendations to significantly downzone a property where it could be considered then a taking. Okay. So everybody clear on that? It's got a lot of words on here just because what we end up doing is putting this slide deck up on the website so that folks can take the time and digest that, as well as provide this link here at the bottom. But again, just sort of want to bring to attention the idea of taking, and that you don't want to make that recommendation, taking it to even open space and taking away all that investment or even property taxes that the person has paid on it for whatever number of years. That becomes an issue. Okay. The other sort of along with the taking is the property value issue and taxes. So if there's a recommendation to upzone somebody's property, somebody might say, well, now I'm having to pay more taxes on this, even though I'm just still a single family home. So the Office of Planning and Zoning, we defer to SAC is this, I should have put that out, spelled that out here, but it's the State Department of Assessment and Taxation. They're the ones that do these assessments on the properties, and they, again, from what I understand, there's a lot of criteria that goes into assessing these properties, and then whether there is any bump up or down in those taxes and the property or the assessed value of the property. So we do advise individuals to contact the actual State Department of Assessment and Taxation office. We've got the phone number down below. We'll provide, like I said, as this gets posted to the website so that the public has the opportunity to have this information available when we go through our analysis each month. And again, just want to state that due to the level of criteria and it being, the analysis being done by a different department, we do advise folks to contact them with their own individual situation so that they can have that conversation with, the State Department of Assessment and Taxation. Okay. Okay, so again, those are just some of the things issues that we've run into over the past couple rounds where it may sort of delay or people have some hesitation about making decisions. Are there any other issues? I know I'm sort of asking you before you're actually doing the exercise, but is there anything else that you may be thinking about that could cause you any hesitation in making decisions? Again, once we get into it, you'll be able to sort of see how this flows a little bit better and any issues that come up at that point. Okay, so how we're gonna be making then decisions in May when you all have the opportunity to make recommendations. First, we're looking for consensus. So we're gonna be going from community to community and sort of say, okay, you all have, based on this, here, office planning staff, we'll sort of provide the overview of the community and say, here's the zoning here, land use, this is sort of the vision, this is some of the recommendations that the Office of Planning and Zoning has made. And we'll ask you all, do you want to make any recommendations in this area? Do you agree with the Office of Planning and Zoning? And so we'll look around the room and see if people are like, okay, that looks okay. Or somebody's like, nope, I got a lot of heartburn about a certain decision. We'll want to talk about that, right? But if there is consensus, we're going to move ahead with something. And as we look, again, the consensus continuing here, we sort of got 5 stations. Stop, hold is sort of that, you know what, I'm having heartburn about this decision or recommendation, or I want to talk about this area a little bit more. That's where we're going to stop, talk about it. If everybody can get behind it, start seeing some nods, we're back to consensus, we're good to go. And then everything also to the right then, stand aside, somebody says, I'm not really familiar with this area, but I'll trust the group on this. We'll keep moving, right? Or even somebody that says, I love this idea or this recommendation. We're gonna keep moving. However, if we realize that, again, there's some heartburn, we have some discussion, we're still just not getting to any type of resolution, then we're gonna have a vote. Okay, Christina will ask for the vote. And for these types of decisions, we're looking for a 2/3 majority vote on whatever recommendation it is. Okay. Good. Again, Jim, if I can call on you, as we were going through this in previous rounds, we did have some votes where it's sort of, people were just getting stuck, not really understanding what the issues or maybe the trade-offs may be. And so, I think the vote worked and everybody. Okay,
there's always sort of a handful of hot properties, and those typically go to vote. At the end of the day, everyone sort of has their say, you kind of raise your hand and Mark and Christina in this case do their best to count the votes and go with the 2/3 majority.
Yeah, and there is that opportunity too, where say the minority can still share a position, and we can share that then, as we move through this process with other but recommendation boards like the Planning Advisory Board. Okay. And say, hey, you know what? I mean, there was a situation in Region 1 where the group was really split, like 7 to 8, after even a couple votes at different meetings. And so we shared that with the Planning Advisory Board and said, hey, this was a situation where we're sharing with you what the majority voted on and was approved, but we also want to share with you that this was really a 50-50 split. Really to emphasize to the Planning Advisory Board that it's a toss-up, right? Okay. Okay, so we've got to keep track of these recommendations. And so this is how, so if I fast forward here, this is another example where we have, I'll jump down here to the comprehensive zoning table. CZ is your comprehensive zoning, because we also have plan land use changes that we're keeping track of. So that would be a PLU. Or if it's a development policy area or development policy area overlay, that would be a DPA, DPAO dash. We're in region 5, that won't be changing for any of our recommendations. The community code, we've got, for the purposes of our meeting over the next month or so, we don't necessarily need to get into the community code, but we just will be tracking which community these recommendations will be occurring. So for example, we have the Odenton community, we have the Crofton community, Odenton. And again, I can link you to where those community names are. It's not a steadfast, hard line of where exactly the Crofton, where you all may consider the Crofton line being. We took a lot of things into account when we drew up these community boundaries back during Plan 2040, like man-made barriers, natural barriers, zip codes, historical maps. So again, you may not necessarily, you might say, oh, well, there's a community here, but that's not represented on the map. Again, just want to let you all know that for the purposes of this exercise, the region plans, these designations have already been agreed upon during Plan 2040. And then change number, again, this is just, again, our opportunity to track what type of change it is and how many changes there have been. So for example, an owner application, they'll be going from 1 to 99, for example. If it's an office planning and zoning recommended change, we have our numbers. If there's a stakeholder advisory committee recommended change that the office planning and zoning didn't make, you all will have your numbers as well. And then the remaining numbers here are as we move through the process a little bit later. Got it. And then the consistency changes are those types of changes that I mentioned before, where we're just trying to snap zoning lines, parcel boundaries, the open space type of changes, things like that. Okay.
So Mark, everything we do here is gonna have the first 3 variables that are gonna be CZ, R5, ODT, and then what's gonna change is the right-hand number.
Well, so depending upon what type of change is that first box, whether it's a comprehensive zoning change, or whether it's a plan land
So
use.
that could change too.
That could change,
Okay.
as well as community code. So we've got an Odenton code, we've got a Crofton code, we've got a Two Rivers.
Okay.
code. Yeah, so that's gonna change, and so does the change number, yeah.
So all you get is R5.
Yeah.
The only one that does.
Yeah, that's our region. Okay, so again, I brought this up before, but just to show you that, all this will be tracked and illustrated then within the region plan. So that folks have some breadcrumbs to go back to look back and see where a change was made, and why it was made. And of course, at the end here, there is any count. Yeah, so this is a big point I do want to make is, despite all these recommendations, the SAC recommendation, Planning Advisory Board recommendation, and the Office Planning and Zoning recommendation, County Council has the authority to amend the final recommended zoning recommendations. He's recommended twice, the recommended zoning change or plan land use change or development policy area. They have the authority and the privilege to make their own changes. So, like I said, is all, there have been situations where the SAC, PAB, and the Office Planning and Zoning all agree on one zoning recommendation, and the county council can say, I'm gonna change that. Okay?
So it's like a line item veto, right? They can.
Well, it would just be an amendment, because we go to the county council and say, here's our final recommended plan and our final recommended zoning map. And they say, we're going to amend, right, we're gonna change this one, the zoning on this one property, for example.
But that could also happen from us, the advisory board could change it too, right, before the council sees it,
So, right, so that's what we capture here is your recommendation,
right?
right? Stakeholder advisory committee, y'all are advising office planning and zoning, you're essentially advising the planning advisory board and the county council, but again, the county council has that authority and privilege to take all of this into consideration, but still make their own decision.
And that's why for Two Rivers, you're like, I wouldn't mess with that because it's probably gonna get, because it's so many odd things that happen there. The council would probably go back to the original.
You know, again, with the plan unit developments, it's really just been our policy from, and that was, I think, actually mentioned in Plan 2040, they've been, I don't think that they've made any amendments to, any zoning within plan unit developments. Because they recognize that unique agreement as well.
I'm gonna ask, if there is an opportunity to provide testimony at council or whether written or in person, right, to continue your voice feedback.
Yeah, so with that, talking about opportunities for public comment. So when we meet next month to make recommendations on the zoning map, that is then the opportunity to, your all's opportunity to make these recommendations that then get chopped out to the public for public review in, say, the middle of June or late June, until the middle of July or late July. So the public will have their opportunity to review the zoning map. We'll digest all those comments, we'll summarize them for you all and present them to you in August. You'll have that opportunity to react to those and make any additional changes. The public also has that opportunity, like we have at all our meetings, a public comment period to, again, make their case. Again, it's still limited to 2 minutes, right, or the discretion of the chair for public comment for our SAC meetings. When it goes to the planning advisory board, same idea, there's a public comment period. There's also an application period during the planning advisory board period as well. So at that point, there's that opportunity where a property owner could come in with an application that you all are not seeing or providing a recommendation on. Okay, so I also want to set that expectation. When it goes to county council, there is that opportunity for public comment again. And Jim, I think you were saying, like, you as SAC members could come and speak during county council, you can come to the planning advisory board. But while at county council, there is also another opportunity for property owners to come in with a rezoning application. Okay, so again, just to sort of set expectations that there may be applications and there may be changes after you all provide recommendations. Okay.
Would we be notified of those changes?
We would ask that you follow along in the process. We can provide, we provide summaries of the comments as well as the applications during planning advisory board. And then when it goes to council, there is a list of applications that are going to be pursued during the council process. So we can share that with you all if you are burnt out. Okay. Yeah, so Jim, did that get it? Yeah. So there's a lot of opportunities yet still after you all complete your work for the public to stay engaged and make lobby for their own property or comment on any recommendations. Okay, I think lastly here, second to last slide here is ethics and conflicts of interest. So again, at the beginning of this process, when you all fill out your application, we had asked you to fill out a conflict of interest. If you had filled that out, and there's a property that we're discussing that you have a vested interest in, You may participate in that discussion, but you may not participate in, we're gonna watch you, you can't shake your head, and you can't vote, during that time. Like I said, just participate in the discussion. Now, there may be situations where you may not, if you have a vested interest in a property, where we may not know, Office of Planning and Zoning, or your peers may not know that you have that interest in that property. But there may be somebody on, just one or two people on the SAC or the public that say, I think that person does, and brings that to the Office of Planning and Zoning's attention. We're not the arbiter in this situation. We ask that you reach out to the Ethics Commission and pursue that potential complaint with the Ethics Commission, because they have a record of your conflict of interest form, and they're the ones that review these types of situations and then can make a decision based on that and gather more information. So again, we ask that during these discussions, you act in good faith, disclose any financial interest in property or any other type of conflict you may have with the property. And we would appreciate that, but again, we realize that there may be rumors or there may be people that, individuals that may not want to share information. But again, those complaints, please work with the County Ethics Commission. We've got their contact information up here as well. Okay. And again, the bottom line here is your recommendations, as well as Office of Planning and Zoning's recommendations, are advisory. We don't have the authority to adopt the zoning or the plan land use development policy areas. Okay, so again, work through the Ethics Commission, and if you do have any concerns about anyone working unethically throughout this process. Okay. So to sort of get ready for the discussion next month, we wanted to just again recap some of the things that we have heard or areas to consider. So a lot of discussion that we've heard about over the past, we started in November, the past 5 or 6 months. Reinvestment, revitalization in vacant properties in Odenton or along Maryland 3. Looking at the environment or infrastructure systems within Region 5, noting the pedestrian disconnect between some of the residential and commercial areas, and thinking about it in a land use sense, not necessarily a transportation sense, right, is thinking about what we talked about earlier with mixed use, where if you have a horizontally or vertically mixed use property, zone property, then maybe we're not seeing that pedestrian disconnect anymore. And that could potentially solve some issues. So think about that. And then some specific areas, some came up just this evening that you all were talking about, that you may want to provide a little more analysis into or conversation or attention to, right? The landfill area, Maryland 175 west of Maryland 3. So as you go west from Maryland 3, along 175, there are some residential properties that are either zoned residential low density. We did receive some applications from property owners there that may want to upzone their properties. So again, driving around the area, taking that into consideration. The dividing line between Region 5 and Region 8 is Maryland 450. So that's why I say look on the north side of 450. There's a variety of uses, a lot of different types of uses. So think about how you may want to provide some type of recommendation or how you see that area growing over the next 20 years or so. Evergreen Road behind the Wall Chapel Shopping Center, we did receive some applications there. Again, a low density type of subdivision, well, platted area. So again, if you're thinking about driving around areas, think about driving up and down Evergreen Road, and then of course Northern Maryland, okay, Portal, Maryland. Okay. So some areas to consider.
Your terminology of upscale,
Upzoning.
upzoning, that mean like going from R8 to R5?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, so again, those are just some areas to consider if you do wanna drive around, to help inform the discussion next month.
I want to drive up and down Route 3, nothing more fun than that.
I'm sure y'all have done it. And maybe now you're just driving, maybe just sitting in Route 3, right?
That's when you admire
Yes, right? So get your notepad out when when you go to Target and plan to take some notes. Okay? So with that, I'll hand it over to Christina if you want to take, public comment.
Sorry, I had to look up where Evergreen Road was. I was like, I know I've seen the sign, but did I have to go down Evergreen Road? Okay. Okay, I'd like to welcome public comment at this time. If you're interested in speaking, please raise your hand and state your name. We'll identify those members of the public in person first, and then identify those attending via Zoom. Do we have anybody on Zoom?
We'll look at you right now. Just Liz Miller, she's our, with office planning.
If you could please limit your comments to 2 minutes, and then if you'd like to share more information, please email the Region 5 team at region5@aacounty.org. We have any members in person for public comment? Saving it for next month, right? Okay. Yeah. Can you just state your name?
It's like a war zone, along some of these roads. There's something with the traffic cameras on. Can you consider doing something like that? Especially on Route 3, people are racing, leaking in and out. Can anything be done about that?
Like speed cameras, is that
Yeah.
what you're thinking? We can look into, maybe having a strategy like that, working that into a strategy, like safety considerations for there and for.
Even though it's a state, we can,
That could be a recommendation.
yeah, because I know, even just around here, we've started to get speed cameras and stuff, which is great. I hope they slow people down, but. Okay, any other, thank you very much for your comment there, appreciate it. Any others?
The other thing I wanted to note about public comment is, for all our meetings so far, we've had public comment at the end. When we have our zoning meetings, we'll be having public comment at the beginning so that folks have that opportunity to share information before you get into your discussion, your recommendations.
But while we're discussing, no public comment, right?
Correct. Yeah, so the public will be invited to attend the meetings next month where again, we make those recommendations on zoning. Public comment will just be at the beginning. Public will be invited. You can sort of give the SAC the opportunity for the space to review the maps. Just ask that you give them some space during that analysis. And yeah, their comments during the time.
And with that, we'll close public comment.
Alright, next steps, next meetings are May 14th and the 21st. We ask that you please be on time, recognize that is critical. And before the next meeting, we ask that you also take some time to drive, walk, or just generally see the region, outside of the areas that you may live in, just to kind of get a feel for, what else is going on in the region, the broader region. And while you're doing that, if you could try to talk to people, not just in your own community, but, seek different opinions and, others that might be overlooked in public processes like this. And if you could also fill out the doodle poll for the August meeting, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, our next two meetings are in May and then in August, where we be, again, reconvening to review any feedback on the draft strategies as well as the draft zoning map. those August meetings, we do plan on two. If y'all feel like we can do it in one, let's do it in one, but we'll plan for two. That would be the opportunity to essentially bless the plan and provide your approval, if that's the case for the plan, and the zoning. map. So August would be our last meetings. Yeah. Okay, so any questions on any of the upcoming dates or things that we have planned? There's the draft strategy questionnaire. This will wrap up the topical issues and items that we've discussed again over the past few months on the issues listed there. We do plan on launching that in the next few days. So look for that and share that with your community. And we'll share that feedback then in August. Okay.
Okay. And then with that, do we have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
I move we adjourn.
A second? Yeah, do a second. Okay, then, we'll move that to vote. All in favor? Okay, any opposed? Hey, the meeting has been adjourned at 7:12 PM on April 23rd.